The moon was a coin, tossed over the ridge, silver and indifferent when he found her. She was slumped against a split-rail fence under the wide, empty sky, a rope at her wrists, and a blanket that did more to hide the shape of her belly than to warm it. The town farther up the road hummed with lamplight and the murmurs of men who sleep easy because they're paid to look the other way. The sheriff's horse stood tied to a hitching post, restless and stamped with the county brand. A lantern swung beside it, its light faint and careless. The man who dismounted from the shadows moved like a rumor people paid to ignore. He carried the kind of lean sheriff's posters had inked: wanted, dangerous, reward. His hat shaded a face that had been sun-chewed, a jaw cut by long highways and harsher choices. He had hands that could pick a lock like a man uncorking a bottle, and a name that rustled in the mouths of mothers, warning their children over the stove. His name was Ezra Blackwood, though few who knew that name were still alive to speak it. The wanted posters called him the Midnight Rider, a moniker that had followed him across 3 territories and through 7 years of running from a past that refused to stay buried. He'd been a preacher once, in another life, before he'd learned that sometimes the devil wore a badge and sometimes angels had to work outside the law. Nobody called him anything soft. He earned his bread on the wrong side of law, lived alone in a weathered cabin with a roadmap of regrets. Loneliness had a shape to it, a weathered coat, a battered packhorse, and an eyes-only view of the horizon where no man could catch him. The cabin sat in a canyon 40 miles from nowhere, hidden behind a waterfall that froze solid in winter and sang with snowmelt in spring. It was a place where a man could disappear from the world, where the only visitors were coyotes and the occasional eagle riding the thermals up from the valley floor. For 7 years, Ezra had made that canyon his sanctuary and his prison. He'd furnished it with things stolen and things found: a bed taken from a corrupt judge's mansion, books liberated from a banker who'd never read them, a piano carried piece by piece from a saloon whose owner had sold children to men with darker appetites. Each item told a story of justice denied and retribution taken, of a world where the law served only those who could afford to buy it. The path that had led him to this life was paved with good intentions and bitter betrayals. He'd been Pastor Blackwood once, ministering to a small congregation in a town called Mercy Falls. He'd believed in redemption then, in the power of prayer and the promise of salvation. He'd married young couples and baptized their babies, buried the old and comforted the grieving. He'd thought himself a shepherd tending his flock, protecting them from the wolves that prowled the edges of civilization. But wolves, he'd learned, sometimes wore sheep's clothing. The town's mayor, a man named Cornelius Harwick, had presented himself as a pillar of the community, generous with donations to the church, kind to widows and orphans, always ready with a helping hand for those in need. Beneath that facade, Harwick ran a network of corruption that stretched from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. He trafficked in human misery, selling children to brothels, women to mining camps, men to work gangs that labored them to death. Ezra had discovered the truth by accident, arriving at Harwick's mansion to deliver last rites to the mayor's dying mother. What he'd found instead was a basement full of cages, children's eyes reflecting the lamplight like trapped animals, women chained to walls like livestock awaiting auction. The sight had broken something fundamental in Ezra's soul, the part that believed in justice, in mercy, in the inherent goodness of mankind. He'd tried to work within the system first, reporting what he'd seen to the territorial authorities. But Harwick's corruption reached far beyond Mercy Falls, extending into courthouses and federal offices, buying silence with gold and ensuring cooperation with blackmail. The sheriff, who should have arrested Harwick instead, arrested Ezra, charging him with trespassing and defamation. The judge, who should have heard the evidence instead, sealed the records and ordered Ezra to leave the territory or face imprisonment for disturbing the peace. That night, as Ezra sat in his jail cell awaiting transport to the territorial prison, he'd made a choice that would define the rest of his life. If the law wouldn't stop Harwick, then the law would have to be circumvented. If justice couldn't be bought, then it would have to be stolen. If good men wouldn't act, then good men would have to become something else. He'd picked the lock on. His cell with a nail file smuggled in his Bible. The same Bible he'd used to comfort the dying and bless the newborn. He'd walked out of that jail, a changed man, leaving his collar and his faith on the cell floor behind him. Pastor Blackwood had died that night, and the Midnight Rider had been born in his place. When he saw her, something old and ferocious eased. Inside him, he had been taught to move away from trouble. Trouble had a way of swallowing outlaws for good, but this was not a stray fistfight or a crooked poker game. This was a woman with a life growing inside her, left in the cold because somebody with a badge had decided she was currency. The sheriff, who stood a few paces away, laughing into his palm, had a reputation for selling anything for a favor or a fistful of coin. Tonight, he had sold a pregnant stranger as if she were a crate of winter radishes. Sheriff Morton Pike was a man who'd grown fat on corruption, his belly stretching the buttons of his vest, while his soul shrank with every transaction. He ran the town of Cedar Hollow like a personal fiefdom, collecting tribute from honest businesses while protecting those who paid the highest bribes. Pike had started small, taking $1 here and there to look the other way when drunks got rowdy, accepting a free meal in exchange for allowing gambling in the back rooms of saloons. But corruption was like a cancer, growing and spreading until it consumed everything healthy it touched. Soon, Pike was selling information to cattle rustlers, providing safe passage for bank robbers, and eventually graduating to the most profitable crime of all, human trafficking. The woman slumped against the fence was just the latest in a long line of Pike's transactions. Her name was Ruth Whitmore, though she'd almost forgotten it herself after months of being referred to only as merchandise or inventory. She'd been a schoolteacher in a small farming community until drought had forced her family to seek work elsewhere. Her husband had been killed in a mining accident, leaving her pregnant and penniless in a world that had little patience for either condition. She was awake enough to blink at him with eyes like a late storm, each inhale a labor of courage. The rope at her wrists cut into swell of skin. The blanket did little. When her gaze met his, the road between them shortened. She wasn't pleading for pity so much as asking for one plain thing: not to be left where men like the sheriff left women. Ruth had learned not to hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that men like Pike exploited with cruel efficiency. She'd seen what happened to women who hoped. They ended up broken in ways that never properly healed, their spirits crushed as surely as if they'd been trampled by wild horses. Better to expect nothing and be surprised by kindness than to hope for rescue and be destroyed by disappointment. But there was something different about the man who'd emerged from the shadows. He moved with purpose rather than predatory intent, his eyes holding concern rather than calculation. When he looked at her, she didn't see the cold assessment of a buyer evaluating merchandise. She saw recognition, not of her face, but of her humanity. He knew, before she could talk, she had been priced and bartered, and that the price had been paid by a man who wore gloves with gold threads. He also knew, with the kind of certainty that belongs to men who have stared down timetables and gunfire, that if he walked away, she would not belong to anyone who would keep her safe. The buyer Pike had found for Ruth was a man named Beauregard Dalton, who ran a mining operation in the mountains, where workers died so frequently that no one asked questions about new arrivals or sudden disappearances. Dalton collected women, the way other men collected horses or cattle, as property to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful. He wore expensive gloves to hide hands that were stained with more than mine dust, and his smile never reached eyes that had seen too much suffering to retain any warmth. Dalton had specific requirements for his purchases. He wanted women who were young enough to work, but old enough to understand their place, intelligent enough to be useful, but broken enough not to cause trouble. Pregnant women were particularly valuable because their condition made them less likely to attempt escape, and their eventual children could be raised from birth to accept their fate as property. There was danger stitched into the decision to move. He heard the sheriff call out a name, a bark that summoned two men from the bar with coin-sour faces and the same kind of greed as a wolf under feed. He had a bounty on his head that filled the columns of newspapers and the minds of easy men. Helping her would pin a brighter target to his back. The bounty on Ezra Blackwood had grown over the years as his campaign against corruption had claimed more victims. $500 had become 1,000, then 2,000, then 5,000. As his reputation spread and his effectiveness increased, he'd freed 36 children from Harwick's operation before burning the mansion to the ground with Harwick inside it. He'd exposed a corrupt judge who'd been selling verdicts to the highest bidder. He'd robbed 7 banks that had been foreclosing on widows and orphans, returning the stolen properties to their rightful owners. Each act of vigilante justice had added to his legend and his price. Bounty hunters tracked him across the territories. Federal marshals investigated his crimes, and Pinkerton detectives built files thick as dictionaries detailing his movements and methods. Some wanted him for the reward money. Others wanted him for the challenge he represented, the ultimate test of their skills as manhunters. Yet a thing inside him, older than his own, wanted posters, lit and moved his feet forward. It was the same impulse that had driven him to become a preacher in the first place. The need to protect the innocent, to stand between the wolves and the sheep, to ensure that those who couldn't defend themselves had someone willing to fight on their behalf. "You don't belong in the dark like this," he said, and his voice was sand and silk. He had not intended to make promises, not to anyone, but the words came soft and certain. The words carried weight because they were true. Ruth Whitmore didn't. Belong chained to a fence, awaiting sale to a man who would work her to death in a mountain mine. She belonged in a classroom, teaching children to read and write, helping them understand that knowledge was the key to freedom. She belonged in a home where her child could grow up safe and loved, where bedtime stories replaced the nightmares that now filled her sleep. She gave him a look that was less surprised than assessing. "I'm not much to belong to," she said, and the edge of her laugh broke like ice on a pail. The self-deprecation in her voice told its own story. Ruth had been taught by cruel experience that her value was measured only by her usefulness to others. As a teacher, she'd been valued for her ability to educate children. As a wife, she'd been valued for her domestic skills and her willingness to follow her husband wherever his work took him. As a widow, she'd discovered that society had no use for her beyond what she could contribute through manual labor or other services. The pregnancy had made her situation even more precarious. While carrying a child should have been seen as a blessing, in her circumstances, it had become a burden that made her less employable and more vulnerable to exploitation. She'd lost 3 jobs because employers didn't want to deal with a worker who might need time off for childbirth, and the meager savings she'd managed to accumulate had been exhausted long before she'd encountered Sheriff Pike. "Maybe not," he answered, and the lie of him hardened into something that could be trusted in that moment. "Maybe you belong to no one who'd sell you for a bottle. Come on." Ezra's response contained layers of meaning that went beyond mere words. He was acknowledging her pain, while simultaneously rejecting the premise that human beings could be owned or sold at all. His years as a preacher had taught him that every person possessed inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their circumstances or the opinions of others. His years as an outlaw had shown him how easily that dignity could be stripped away by those who wielded power without conscience. The transformation from pastor to vigilante hadn't changed his fundamental beliefs about human worth. It had simply changed his methods for protecting it. Where once he'd relied on prayer and moral suasion, he now used lockpicks and gunpowder. Where once he'd sought to change hearts through sermons, he now changed behavior through direct action. The tools were different, but the mission remained the same. Selling someone was a felony inked in the wrong book, but around these parts, the law the men in badges kept was elastic and hungry. The sheriff made a motion like he was offering a private joke. "You got money, outlaw? Or you want to tussle for her like a cheaper kind of highwayman?" His grin was the kind that learned features from other men's cruelty. Pike's casual attitude toward human trafficking revealed the depth of his moral corruption. He spoke of selling Ruth as if she were livestock, with no more concern for her welfare than he'd show for a horse or cow. His question to Ezra was purely transactional. Did the outlaw want to buy the woman or steal her? Either way, Pike would profit, whether through direct payment or through the bounty he could collect for capturing a wanted man. The outlaw had neither the money the sheriff believed he could spend, nor the desire to barter with blows under a lantern. He did, however, have a way with a coin and a way with choice. He reached into the leather of his coat and palmed the weight of a few bills and a ring he'd once promised to a girl who had gone west with someone else. The ring was a painful reminder of the life Ezra might have lived if he'd chosen differently. Her name had been Mary Catherine, and she'd been the banker's daughter in Mercy Falls, beautiful, intelligent, and blessed with a laugh that could brighten even the darkest day. They'd planned to marry after he'd established himself in his ministry, to build a life together filled with children and community service and the quiet satisfactions of domestic happiness. But Mary Catherine had been practical as well as beautiful, and when Ezra's confrontation with Mayor Harwick had made him a wanted man, she'd made the sensible choice to protect herself and her future. She'd married a prosperous merchant from California and moved west to start a new life, leaving Ezra with only memories and a ring he'd spent his savings to buy. He'd carried the ring for 7 years, not out of lingering romantic attachment, but as a reminder of what his choices had cost him. Every time he felt the weight of it in his pocket, he remembered the price of standing up to corruption, the loss of love, family, community, and all the simple pleasures that made life worth living. It was a talisman of sacrifice, a physical representation of the road not taken. The price of his rescue would be the kind of thing that traded one moral stain for another, paying a man who trafficked human beings for a cigarette to be freed. In the voice that felt colder than the night, he offered the coin anyway. It was a small dirge for his own stubborn soul. The moral complexity of the situation wasn't lost on Ezra. By paying Pike for Ruth's freedom, he was participating in the very system he'd spent years fighting against. He was validating the sheriff's belief that human beings were commodities to be bought and sold, that the only difference between slavery and freedom was the ability to pay. Every dollar he handed over would fund Pike's operation and enable future trafficking of other innocent victims. But the alternative was to leave Ruth in chains, to abandon her to whatever fate Dalton had planned for her and her unborn child. Moral purity was a luxury Ezra couldn't afford when an innocent life hung in the balance. Sometimes doing the right thing required participating in wrong systems, accepting moral compromise in service of a greater good. The sheriff looked at the bill as if it were a map to a sudden fortune and took it, counting the shine like a man who counts favors owed. They both watched him pick up the woman and stand her on wobbly feet. She shouldn't have had to lean on him, but she did. He slid the blanket around her shoulders and wrapped the rope into his own hand like a promise he would not let it tight again. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the scraping of boot heels on packed dirt, to the mule bray far off, to the sheriff's laugh that had a bitter edge. He did not turn his back on the sheriff, when he left. He walked the other way, weighed down by hands that had stolen and hands that had held, and by the knowledge that the sheriff had catalogued him in his ledger and had reasons to hunt him now that he had spent coin on what lawmen called private goods. Pike's laugh contained a promise of future trouble. The sheriff now had evidence that the Midnight Rider had been in Cedar Hollow, that he'd spent money on human trafficking, and that he'd shown a weakness for protecting innocent women. All of that information was valuable to the bounty hunters and federal marshals who'd been tracking Ezra across the territories. Pike would sell that information as surely as he'd sold Ruth, trading intelligence for favor with law enforcement or bounty hunters. More immediately, Pike now had a personal grudge against Ezra. The outlaw's rescue of Ruth had disrupted a profitable transaction, had cost Pike both immediate payment from Dalton and future credibility with his criminal associates. In Pike's twisted worldview, Ezra had stolen from him, and theft demanded retaliation. The sheriff would use every resource at his disposal to track down the Midnight Rider and collect the bounty on his head. As they moved into the black between town and the woods, the outlaw sensed the first true thing about the woman beside him. She would be both his reckoning and the only soft thing left in his life. He had no right to salvation, but he carried it all the same. Ruth represented everything Ezra had lost when he'd chosen the outlaw's path. She was innocence in a world that rewarded corruption, hope in a landscape of despair, the possibility of redemption in a life defined by violence and moral compromise. Her presence forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding for 7 years. Was he still the man who'd once stood in a pulpit preaching about love and forgiveness? Could someone who'd killed and stolen and lied ever find his way back to the light? The irony wasn't lost on him that salvation might come through protecting someone else rather than saving himself. For years he'd been focused on his campaign against corruption, treating his vigilante activities as a form of penance for his inability to work within legal channels. But caring for Ruth and her unborn child offered a different kind of redemption, the chance to create something positive rather than simply destroying what was negative. The moon slid behind a cloud, and the road swallowed their footsteps, leaving a hush that tasted like the beginning of something irrevocable. Behind them, by the lantern, the sheriff spat tobacco and asked somebody whether a wanted man would be crazy enough to bring trouble into his town. Nobody answered then. They were watching instead, like a slow burn that might someday become a prairie fire. The witnesses to their transaction were already calculating angles and opportunities. Some would sell information to Pike about which direction Ezra and Ruth had traveled. Others would spread word to bounty hunters and law enforcement about the Midnight Rider's presence in the area. A few might even organize their own pursuit, hoping to claim the substantial reward for themselves. The outlaw tightened his hand around the rope and kept walking. In the dark, she let the first quiet sound left in a woman whose life had been folded and priced, an exhale that was more relief than thanks. They had only made the first hard decision. Danger was already shaping its shadow behind them. The path ahead led through 20 miles of rough country before reaching the canyon where Ezra had made his home. It was territory he knew intimately. Every game trail and water source, every cave and crevice that could provide shelter, every vantage point that offered a clear view of approaching enemies. He'd spent years preparing these escape routes, catching supplies and establishing safe houses throughout the region. But traveling with Ruth would change everything. She was in the advanced stages of pregnancy, making it impossible for her to move quickly or quietly through difficult terrain. Her condition would require frequent rest stops and careful attention to her physical needs. Most importantly, childbirth could begin at any time, forcing them to find shelter and medical assistance in hostile territory. "What's your name?" he asked quietly as they walked through the darkness. "Ruth," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth Whitmore, I know who you are. Everyone knows the Midnight Rider's reputation, but I don't know why you helped me. The question had layers of meaning. Ruth understood that Ezra had taken enormous risks to free her, that his intervention had likely increased the danger to his own life exponentially. Outlaws didn't typically concern themselves with the welfare of strangers, especially not pregnant women who would slow them down and attract unwanted attention. His motivation was a puzzle that demanded explanation. Because you reminded me of someone I used to know, Ezra said, though he immediately realized the inadequacy of his answer. Ruth didn't remind him of Mary Catherine or his sister Sarah or any specific woman from his past. She reminded him of his former self, the man who'd believed that protecting the innocent was life's highest calling, that standing up to injustice was worth any personal cost. They made slow progress through the night, stopping frequently to allow Ruth to rest and adjust to the physical demands of travel. Ezra used his knowledge of the terrain to find the easiest paths and the most defensible camping spots, always keeping one eye on their back trail for signs of pursuit. He knew Pike would organize a search party as soon as possible, and that other bounty hunters would join the chase once word spread of his presence in the area. As dawn approached, they found temporary shelter in a cave Ezra had stocked with supplies years earlier. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden and defensible, offering protection from both weather and enemies. Ruth collapsed gratefully onto the pile of blankets Ezra had cached there, her strength nearly exhausted by the night's travel. "The baby's coming soon," Ruth said quietly, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. "Maybe days, maybe hours. I can feel it changing position, getting ready." The news hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd delivered babies before during his time as a pastor, but always with the assistance of experienced midwives and the comfort of proper medical facilities. Delivering a child in a cave while being pursued by bounty hunters and corrupt lawmen would test his skills and courage in ways he'd never imagined. "Do you have medical supplies?" Ruth asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite her exhaustion. Clean cloths, sharp knife, something to tie off the cord. Ezra inventoried his cached supplies, grateful for his habit of over-preparation. He had basic medical equipment, including a surgical knife he'd stolen from a corrupt doctor who'd been performing illegal operations on trafficked women. There were clean bandages, bottles of whiskey for sterilization and pain management, and even a small manual on emergency childbirth he'd acquired during a raid on a medical college. "We'll manage," he said, though privately he wondered if they'd have time for a safe delivery before their pursuers found them. Pike would organize the search efficiently, using his knowledge of local terrain and his network of informants to narrow down possible hiding places. Professional bounty hunters would join the search, bringing tracking skills and weaponry that would make evasion increasingly difficult. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful movement and growing tension. They traveled only at night, using game trails and creek beds to avoid leaving tracks. During daylight hours, they sheltered in caves and abandoned cabins, always listening for sounds of approaching riders. Ruth's condition deteriorated steadily, the physical stress of travel combining with the approaching birth to exhaust her reserves of strength. On the third night, as they approached the final ridge before Ezra's canyon sanctuary, Ruth's labor began in earnest. The contractions started as mild discomfort, but quickly intensified to waves of pain that left her gasping and barely able to walk. Ezra knew they wouldn't make it to the cabin. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not. He found shelter in a small grove of trees near a stream, the best he could do given their circumstances. Using his cached supplies and the skills he'd learned as a pastor, Ezra prepared for the most important delivery of his life. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who'd spent years dealing in death was about to help bring new life into the world. "What will you name the child?" he asked Ruth as her contractions intensified, hoping to distract her from the pain. Hope, she replied without hesitation. If it's a girl, Hope. If it's a boy, Daniel, it means God is my judge. And I figure this child will need all the divine protection it can get. The birth took place as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. Despite the primitive conditions and the constant threat of discovery, the delivery proceeded smoothly. Ezra's hands, trained for picking locks and handling weapons, proved surprisingly gentle when guiding new life into the world. Hope Whitmore announced her arrival with a cry that seemed to chase away the shadows of the night. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair like her mother's, and eyes that held the promise of intelligence and strength. Ruth wept as she held her daughter for the first time. Tears of joy mixed with relief that they had both survived the ordeal. "She's beautiful," Ezra said, and meant it. He'd seen plenty of newborns during his ministry, but there was something special about this child, perhaps because her birth represented hope in the midst of despair, new life emerging from circumstances that should have crushed it. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Pike had finally tracked them down, bringing a posse of deputies and bounty hunters who'd been following their trail through the mountains. Ezra could hear at least 6 different voices, which meant they were badly outnumbered and trapped in a position with limited escape routes. "Stay here," Ezra told Ruth, helping her and the baby deeper into the shelter of the trees. "Keep Hope quiet no matter what happens. If I don't come back, follow the stream north until you reach the mining road, then head east to the town of Redemption. There's a doctor there named Sarah Williams who'll help you." Ruth grabbed his arm as he prepared to leave. "Don't get yourself killed for us. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Ezra replied gently. "This ends here, one way or another." He checked his weapons, 2 Colt 45s and a rifle he'd taken from a corrupt marshal years earlier. 18 shots against 6 men, but they had the advantage of position and firepower. He'd faced worse odds before and survived through careful planning and ruthless execution. This time, though, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Ruth and Hope, for the possibility of redemption that they represented. The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious. Pike and his men approached confidently, expecting to find their quarry exhausted and demoralized. Instead, they found a man transformed by purpose, fighting with the desperate fury of someone protecting everything that mattered to him. Ezra used every advantage the terrain offered, moving from cover to cover with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the bounty hunters were dead and 2 others were wounded. Pike himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but was still alive, cursing and threatening vengeance from behind a fallen log. Ezra could have killed him easily, but something held him back. Perhaps the memory of his former calling, perhaps the hope that even corrupt men could change. "It's over, Pike," Ezra called out, keeping his rifle trained on the sheriff's position. "Your men are dead or wounded. Surrender now and I'll let you live." "Go to hell, preacher," Pike snarled back. "You think saving one woman makes up for all the people you've killed? You're still a murderer, hiding behind a cause." The words stung, because they contained truth. Ezra had killed 13 men during his 7 years as an outlaw, all of them corrupt officials or criminals who'd profited from human misery, but killings nonetheless. Each death had been justified by circumstances necessary to prevent greater evil, but they still weighed on his conscience like stones in his soul. "Maybe you're right," Ezra admitted. "Maybe I am a murderer. But at least I kill people who deserve it, not sell innocent women to men who will work them to death." The philosophical debate was interrupted by the sound of more approaching horses. Reinforcements were arriving. drawn by the gunshots and probably including federal marshals with legal authority to pursue Ezra across territorial boundaries. The brief window for escape was closing rapidly. Ezra made his choice. Instead of finishing off Pike and his surviving men, he gathered Ruth and Hope and headed for his canyon sanctuary. The waterfall that concealed the entrance was only 2 miles away, and once they reached it, they'd be safe from immediate pursuit. The narrow entrance could be defended by 1 man against an army, and the cave system behind it contained enough supplies to last for months. They reached the canyon as the sun reached its zenith, slipping through the curtain of falling water into the hidden sanctuary Ezra had prepared for exactly this situation. The caves were larger than they appeared from outside, extending deep into the mountain and connecting to underground streams that provided fresh water year-round. Ezra had spent years stocking them with food, medical supplies, weapons, and everything else needed for extended isolation. Ruth was amazed by what she found. The caves had been furnished with care and attention to comfort, real beds instead of bedrolls, tables and chairs crafted from local wood, even a small library of books arranged on handmade shelves. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clearly the work of someone who'd planned to make this place a home rather than just a hideout. "How long can we stay here?" Ruth asked as she settled Hope in a makeshift crib Ezra had fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. "As long as necessary," Ezra replied. "I have supplies for 2 years, maybe 3 if we're careful." The entrance is invisible from outside, and the passages connect to exit points miles away. We could disappear completely if we wanted to. But disappearing completely would mean abandoning his mission to fight corruption and protect the innocent. For 7 years, that mission had given his life meaning and purpose, providing justification for the sacrifices he'd made and the violence he'd committed. Could he give it up for the chance at a normal life with Ruth and Hope? The answer came gradually over the following weeks as they settled into their underground sanctuary. Ruth proved to be more than just a victim in need of rescue. She was intelligent, resourceful, and surprisingly tough despite her recent ordeal. She'd been a teacher before Pike had destroyed her life, and she brought that same organizational skill to their hidden community of 3. Hope thrived in the safety of the caves, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. She seemed to sense that she was protected here, that the adults around her would ensure her safety and happiness. Her innocent presence transformed the caves from a hideout into a home, filling the spaces with laughter and hope that had been absent for far too long. "What were you like before?" Ruth asked one evening as they sat by the underground stream, watching Hope sleep peacefully in her crib. "Before you became the Midnight Rider, I mean." Ezra found himself telling her about Pastor Blackwood, about the small church in Mercy Falls and the congregation he'd served with such dedication. He told her about Mayor Harwick and the basement full of cages, about the corruption that had destroyed his faith in legal institutions and set him on the outlaw's path. He told her about Mary Catherine and the life he'd given up, about the loneliness and moral complexity of fighting evil through illegal means. "Do you regret it?" Ruth asked. "Becoming an outlaw instead of staying and fighting within the system?" "Sometimes," Ezra admitted, "but the system was designed to protect people like Harwick. Working within it would have meant accepting that some injustices can't be fixed, that some innocent people have to be sacrificed for the greater good. And now? What do you want now?" It was a question Ezra had been avoiding, but Ruth's direct gaze demanded honesty. What did he want? For 7 years he'd wanted justice, vengeance, the satisfaction of punishing those who escaped legal consequences for their crimes. But holding Hope in his arms, watching Ruth recover her strength and spirit, he found himself wanting something different. He wanted peace. He wanted a family. He wanted the chance to build something positive instead of just tearing down what was negative. He wanted to be Ezra Blackwood again instead of the Midnight Rider, to find redemption through love rather than violence. The decision crystallized slowly, but when it came, it felt inevitable. On a spring morning when Hope was taking her first tentative steps and Ruth was humming while preparing breakfast, Ezra made his choice. He would hang up his guns and put away his wanted posters. He would find a way to build a legitimate life with the woman and child who had become his family. The transformation didn't happen overnight. First, Ezra had to find a way to clear his name, or at least reduce the legal consequences of his outlaw years. Using his network of contacts, honest lawmen, reformed criminals, and victims he'd helped over the years, he began negotiating a deal with federal authorities. His information about corruption networks was valuable enough to warrant consideration. For amnesty, Marshal Samuel Hart, one of the few completely honest federal lawmen in the territory, agreed to meet with Ezra in secret. Hart had been investigating the same corruption networks that Ezra had been fighting, but from within legal channels. He was willing to offer a deal: full cooperation with federal investigations in exchange for reduced charges and witness protection. "You've killed 13 men, Hart said bluntly during their clandestine meeting. "That's not something I can make disappear with paperwork." 13 corrupt officials and criminals, Ezra corrected. Men who were trafficking children, stealing from widows, murdering honest citizens. I can give you evidence on 50 more, including judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials. The negotiations took months, but eventually an agreement was reached. Ezra would serve 2 years in federal prison in exchange for his complete cooperation with corruption investigations. Ruth and Hope would be given new identities and federal protection during his incarceration. When he was released, they would be reunited and relocated to a place where they could start fresh. The hardest part was leaving Ruth and Hope, even temporarily. The 2 years in federal prison stretched like an eternity, marked only by letters, smuggled in through sympathetic guards and the knowledge that his sacrifice was serving a greater good. His testimony brought down the largest corruption network in territorial history, resulting in over 100 arrests and convictions. When Ezra was finally released, he found Ruth and Hope waiting for him in a small farming community in Oregon, where they'd been living under the name Williams. Hope was now 3 years old, a bright and precocious child who called him Papa Ezra and seemed to accept his extended absence as part of the adult world's mysterious workings. Ruth had used the time to establish herself as the town's school teacher, earning the respect and affection of the community through her dedication and skill. She'd also been learning about Ezra's past through the newspaper accounts of the corruption trials, understanding for the first time the full scope of what he'd given up to save her and their daughter. "Are you ready to be ordinary citizens?" Ruth asked on his first night home, as they sat on the porch watching Hope play with a wooden doll he'd carved for her in prison. "More than ready," Ezra replied, and meant it. The years of violence and moral complexity were behind him now. He was ready to be a father, a husband, a member of a community that valued peace and stability over justice and vengeance. They were married that summer in the small church where Ruth taught Sunday school, with Hope serving as flower girl and half the town in attendance. Ezra took the name Thomas Williams, burying the Midnight Rider's identity so completely that even he sometimes forgot about the wanted posters and the legend they'd created. The years that followed were marked by simple pleasures and quiet satisfactions. Ezra worked as a carpenter and locksmith, using his skills for legitimate purposes. Ruth continued teaching, inspiring a generation of children with her wisdom and compassion. Hope grew up surrounded by love and stability, never knowing the full story of her dramatic entrance into the world. But on quiet evenings, when Hope was asleep and the house was still, Ezra and Ruth would sometimes talk about the old days. They'd remember the night he'd found her chained to a fence, the desperate flight through hostile territory, the birth of their daughter in a grove of trees while bounty hunters closed in around them. They'd remember how love had emerged from darkness, how hope had been born from despair, how three broken people had found healing in each other. "Do you ever miss it?" Ruth would ask. "The excitement, the sense of purpose, fighting for justice?" "Never," Ezra would reply, taking her hand in his. "I found something better than justice. I found redemption." As the moon rose over their peaceful valley, silver and constant, Ezra reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd been a coin tossed into darkness, spinning through space without direction or purpose. But when he'd landed, when he'd made the choice to help a pregnant woman chained to a fence, he'd found his true calling at last. The Midnight Rider was dead and buried, his legend already fading into frontier folklore. In his place stood Thomas Williams, husband, father, citizen, living proof that even the darkest souls could find their way back to the light. The moon has set on Ezra Blackwood's journey from outlaw to family man, but his story shines on as a beacon of hope for anyone who's ever felt lost in darkness. His tale reminds us that redemption is always possible, that the choice to help others can transform not just their lives, but our own, and that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't silver coins, but the precious moments we share with those we love. If this story of transformation, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption touched your heart, show your appreciation by hitting that like button. Share this tale with others who believe in second chances and the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. And subscribe to our channel to join a community that celebrates stories of hope triumphing over despair. Because like the moon that watched over Ezra's journey, great stories illuminate the darkness and remind us that no matter how lost we might feel, there's always a path back to the light. They inspire us to make the hard choices, to stand up for what's right, and to never give up on the possibility of redemption. Until our next story unfolds under the silver moon, remember, sometimes salvation comes not from saving ourselves, but from choosing to save someone else. Sometimes the difference between being lost and being found is simply deciding that some things, like love, hope, and the protection of the innocent, are worth any sacrifice. Keep believing in second chances, and we'll see you in the next story.